Back in the day when Quake 3 Arena came out, one of the things that was really crazy about it was not only were you fighting online against other players and using great alien weaponry, and it's all about explosions and it's fast paced and it was just pure sport, but movement became really prominent in the gameplay of that first person shooter. That's something that's easy to take for granted. Obviously, first person shooters, movement is required and strafing was always a part of it. But I feel like when Quake 3 Arena came out, that's really when movement became almost equal to gunfire. You were doing rocket jumps where you can shoot down on the ground and it would propel you forward. You were doing bunny hops where you would just sidle your way side to side forward, and you would use the momentum of your character to propel yourself quicker and quicker. To really be competitive, you had to integrate movement with the gunplay. And Neon White takes that idea and makes a whole game about it. The game seems really weird when you first start it. It's super weird that you're collecting cards. What does this have to do with guns at all? The usefulness of them being cards is precisely because there's no gun in the center of the screen. You need to be able to know what you're using, and cards can have bright colors. You can tell exactly which gun you have based on the color on the corner of the screen just peripherally. It also corresponds to the mechanic of each card not just being a gun. The shotgun becomes not just a way to shoot a barrage of pellets in a cone in front of you, it's also a way to shoot yourself in a kind of arch over an enemy or through an enemy. The rifle gun that you get is not just a way to shoot enemies from afar, it's also a way to propel yourself in a straight line forward, almost like an arrow being flung. Each gun has this purpose. The pistol is a fast shooting armament that also lets you double jump. The rocket becomes one that lets you grapple hook. Every gun has a secondary purpose, and it's a kind of magic purpose, so again, the fact that it's a card really fits. The whole environment of this game is an ethereal, heavenly space. You're supposed to be this neon, which means a human being who died, and you were intended to go to hell, but you get another chance. And that other chance requires you to do each of these little challenges in spaces in heaven. And the challenges are just to finish these spaces as quickly as possible. And the way to finish that space is to kill each of the demons, because the demons are invading heaven, and you have to stop them from invading by killing them very quickly and then making your way to the end. That's the basic story conceit that is just an excuse to have a very fast-paced game where the enemies are the targets that have to be shot, and then you get to have that final run. It's a game about guns with no guns. A lot of first-person shooters, the shooting is the central core. This one, the core is movement. You become the thing being shot. The game is so smart about making sure that nothing is too difficult in terms of how to maneuver. You get a rocket launcher. The rocket can shoot on the ground and it will pocket you up. You can shoot it against a wall and that will launch you up. Realistically, you would have to be very careful about the angle at which you're shooting against the wall or against the ground. But in Neon White, they make it so that if you're just next to the explosion, you'll go up. And they make it so that you fall slow enough that you can maneuver in the air as you fall. Then you're not really getting bogged down in the limitations of movement. The game is very smart about making choices that are completely unrealistic in order to make sure that you're just having a good time and the momentum is consistently moving forward.
I think the Quake rocket jump kind of deserves credit for being the source of this ethos, because even in that game, right, in order for that mechanic to exist, a game developer had to discover that that was fun and say, I'm going to reduce the damage that your rocket does to your own person so that you can enjoy this mechanic more. I'm going to sacrifice realism and aim for something so much more enjoyable. In Neon White, the developers have made so many smart decisions that are just like that. They are not trying to make a game simply that works and has like basic physical properties that are predictable. They also make sure to inject as much fun into that as they can. The cards that you are grabbing are basically just free-form, imaginative concepts of movement. It would be hard to convey these movement abilities as actual physical tools. If you were grabbing something that gives you a double jump, what would that look like?
Rocket boots!
It only really makes sense if you make it a card. What does it mean to grab something that shoots you forward in a fireball? That's not an idea that maps onto reality. It just maps onto, that would be fun to do. There are lots of less fun ways to move. They could have added an ability that makes you oscillate up and down like a sine wave. They could have altered your movement in a way that is just not, that doesn't give you that satisfying rocket jump feeling of just wanting to do this for its own sake. Your goal is just to experience the movement in the most expert way that you can. I felt incredibly cool at the end of most levels of Neon White. I felt like I could put some of my runs into some kind of museum, and I wish I could watch them all and just admire my work. The game is all about perfection, and it's all about taking a bunch of jumbled pieces that you discover one at a time, and you put all your ducks in a row, and eventually, by the end of that process, you can perfectly execute a plan. It forces you to challenge yourself.
One thing that I really enjoyed going through the game was how it was constantly creative with the factors that you need to keep in mind as you're playing. At the very beginning of the game, it was just about the enemies. At some point, one of the characters, Violet, starts leaving behind traps everywhere. And many of these traps are connected in nodes, a big lineup of them. It adds an extra layer of complexity to getting through the level because you're not just thinking, okay, how do I defeat the enemies, which would usually mean just along the way through my route through the level, I'm just going to shoot these people. With the traps, you're thinking, how can I utilize this enemy, this trap, to defeat other enemies and or create shortcuts and or remove obstacles from my way? You're thinking an extra layer deep. There's this one level, it's like one of my favorite, I think, in terms of the puzzle and the solution, which was a whole long lineup of nodes of traps. To get a gold in the level, you do the usual thing where you get through and like you just have to bounce at the right time and hit the right enemies and just aim perfectly and you can get the gold. It feels really satisfying. You eventually get the shortcut, and you'll find that if you actually use the shortcut, you arrive way too early at the exit because the nodes need to be shot. They all explode in a chain reaction, but the chain reaction can be slightly slower than you. So then you had to think about that in terms of, okay, not only do I have to move quickly and aim perfectly and defeat all the things I need to defeat and jump at the right times, but I need to make it so that the chain reaction lands at the end at the same time that I land at the end, because if it happens too early, a whole platform gets taken out, and if it happens too late, well, that's wasted time. So you're kind of trying to line them up in this perfect little trajectory so that they explode and reach the end at the same time that you do. I love that extra layer. At some point, they introduce chests that explode, and the way that they explode is it shoots out all these bullets outward. So much of the game you're just running and shooting. And these chests you need to jump over because the bullets shoot out fast enough that they will kill you. But then you can also shoot the chests ahead of time to defeat groups of enemies. So then you can start using this obstacle, this exploding chest that usually would hurt you. You can use it in your favor. You're thinking of multiple uses of these objects and of these challenges. A lot of the design of the game is trying to challenge you to be forced to move certain ways. And so this game will do things like it'll put bubbles around enemies where you have to enter the bubble in order to pop it. You can't shoot it from the outside. So then it becomes a thing of like, I have to go through that thing. When speedrunning through, you have to think of trajectories through those bubbles that will be quicker than the initial more obvious route. The game is a fast-paced puzzler in that way, and it's constantly creative. It reminds me of a certain kind of ethos or spirit that can be easy to miss in games, which is sometimes games don't need to be fully sensible. Sometimes games can just be games. It is just a game for its own sake. That's perfectly fine. My initial impression of the game was actually more negative than it ended up. I was very focused on the simplicity of it, and I was being very negative about some of the ways in which it didn't seem complex in the ways that are obviously complex. It became very clear, and this is probably obvious to a lot of people who just started up, that the simplicity is very necessary for the core of the design to shine through. Too much information would be easily overwhelming. Because it's a fast-paced puzzle game, the fact that you're moving through these stages quickly and you're replaying so much, the information that's there needs to be vital to the puzzle. Over time, I began to really appreciate that simplicity. The nonsensicalness of it grew on me. It reminded me of like the experience I had with Dreamcast games. When Dreamcast was coming out, it was right in between that transition between arcades and at home. The thing that was so great about Dreamcast games is they were allowed to be really goofy. They were allowed to be really arcadey without that being a negative in terms of longevity. Neon White is like super goofy and arcadey, and it doesn't make too many excuses for itself. In that sense, it's not too pretentious. I think initially I didn't fully appreciate that until I got further along.
Shoot, I better get moving.
This game is very much like speedrunning for beginners in the sense that it's giving you training wheels because they're giving you like a set trajectory of what you need to do. They're giving you everything that you need to know and all the rules that you need to follow. But then they're giving you enough experience within that set of rules that you then get to learn how to think creatively within the boundaries that they set for you.
It's all about memorization. You have to keep a lot of things in your head as you keep going. A speedrun is even more extreme because you usually have to memorize upwards of hours of exact inputs. This is like a very small form of that, where you only have to memorize like a couple minutes. This game packages it in such a way that you can just appreciate the basic craft that goes into designing a game that is about defying the level designer.
That's always the fundamental point of speedrunning. You're testing the boundaries of what you can do in the game. There's always requirements that you have to do to make it through the level. In something like a Mario, if you're going to speedrun that, you really have to survive through various miniature obstacle courses, whether it's avoiding enemies or jumping over pits. You can't fall in those pits too much or hit the enemies too often because then you fail. So then now that's a requirement. The requirement is finessing through whatever limited space there is to get through so that you can make it to the goal. In a game like this, the requirement to speedrun is you have to kill all the enemies through these levels. Because that's the requirement, you know exactly where your limitation is. With that rule in mind of killing each of these enemies, how then can I finesse through that quicker? It leads to some creative thinking given enough time. When I started the game, I was just following the route that was being given to me fairly strictly. The game does this thing where your first run through, if you follow the main route and you just kind of follow the one where all the enemies are lined up and there's a pretty clear like line that you're supposed to follow. If you just do that a few times quickly enough, you can get a gold medal on the level. And just by getting a gold medal, that's enough for you to get what's called insight in this little bar at the bottom. Then you unlock a ghost of your character. You can watch yourself run past and then make judgments on, okay, what are the minor deviations that I can do to move faster? And you unlock a literal hint where there will be one point in the level where the game designers had planted a clue as to where a shortcut might be. There's only one shortcut that you get access to, but that is another kind of route now. It's equivalent to a shortcut in Mario Kart where once you figure out that there's a hole behind a waterfall, you can now just go into that hole behind the waterfall every single time. And that's just a new track. Before you had one track before you knew about the waterfall, now you have another track after you know about the waterfall, and now that's just a new track. And really there's no reason to not do that one. So in this game, you're following the rules while speedrunning. There's still limitations there. What was great is when you get really far in the game and you start really getting used to the mechanics, because you know that the rule is, okay, kill all of these enemies, you can start thinking, what happens if I shoot an enemy from across the map? What happens if I preemptively blow up a barrel and I know that that's going to lead to some chain reaction? And then you can start thinking that way, right? You can start thinking laterally and more creatively.
Putting these strict requirements on yourself means that you are going to suffer for fun. You're going to fail and fail and fail because you enjoy the process of failing. Speedrunning, but in a casual way. The most advanced speedrunners will take advantage of the community. They will come together and they will invent new routes together. And when a new route is discovered, shorter and shorter times are accessible. The goal of a speedrunner is just to keep playing the game as much as you can, chasing an ever-receding goal. Your goal is not to beat the game at a certain time. Your goal is to beat the game in the fastest time humanly possible, which you can't possibly know.
Often speedrunners will get right on the cusp of some record, and there will be points in their run where they know I could have done that one little thing a little bit better. Speedrunning is in a lot of ways an act of devotion to something that you love. In this case, it's video games. A lot of these speedrunners, when they're taking the time to break the game by finding all of the little tricks that the developers hadn't planned for or noticed, it's not breaking in the kind of destructive mode. It's more like someone who's learning how to engineer something. They will take a mechanical object, sometimes take it apart, in order to see how all the pieces came together so that they can reverse engineer how to build it back up. In the process of learning how to reverse engineer, you're actually coming to appreciate how much engineering actually goes on behind the scenes. Video games are engineering feats in a digital space. When speedrunners are trying to crack that next high score in terms of time, they're doing so by getting a much better grasp of some of the engineering feat behind that game that they're playing. Like some of the ways in which, oh, there are holes within this construction that were always hidden to me. And if I work hard enough, I can see them. But the fact that they were hidden is again a testament to how well designed it is. It's not really a failure of the game to have bugs. I worked as a video game tester. I got to see firsthand how many bugs have to be in a game that's shipped. People online, they talk about, if a game comes out, they'll talk about how many bugs there are, and they'll think, oh, what a failure this is, right? And they'll make big jokes about it, like Cyberpunk has all these bugs, and it'll be like the next big thing to just have a meme about how terrible this game is because of the amount of bugs that it has. And no matter how polished you think a game is, it has thousands and thousands of bugs still in it. It's just developers get better and better at tricking the player's attention to make it hidden. Nintendo is a company that's known for releasing really polished products in terms of the lack of bugs, or at least they used to be known for that. I think with the internet, we now become ultra aware how many bugs there are. But even something like Mario, every Mario game can be speedrunned in dramatic ways because of the amount of bugs that are hidden in there. And it's people being devoted to their love of that experience of that platformer that they actually take the time to discover all that stuff. And then you mentioned the community effort. That to me is an additional act of like really appreciating something. It's people talking to each other about a game. That water cooler moment of everyone coming together, explaining their experience with one another and saying, wait, you did that? How did you do that? There's a kind of glory in being the one to figure out how to do X, Y, or Z. And then that becomes a built-up experience over time of what to do. Neon White is that speedrun experience for beginners. It has the training wheels on. I really like that this Neon White game is actually giving us like a taste of that kind of experience. By the time I reach hour 12 or something, the fact that I was starting to try just for my own fun to think ahead in terms of the shortcuts. As soon as I attacked a level, I was thinking, what is the obvious route? And then how do I do the opposite of that to make my way through? And that was a fun mindset to get into because it was completely involuntary. I wasn't planning to start thinking that way. It just sort of became the way to think because so quickly you're noticing like, man, there always is a shortcut and it's usually not obvious the first time through. Why isn't it obvious? What do I have to change about my thinking to make it more obvious? And then that becomes sort of your mindset.
There's some sort of enzyme or hormone when a mother finishes giving birth that makes her forget the pain. After you have forced yourself to replay the same thing over and over in a way that can often be frustrating and tedious if you fail enough times, there is still this ultimate sense of triumph that you get at the end that almost requires you to suspend all those memories you have of being frustrated. You sort of get to look at yourself at the end and say, it doesn't matter how many times I failed. What matters is I did something extremely expert right now. I watched myself do exactly what I needed to do to get the best time I can. There's this like isolated feeling of mastery. You have mastered something. It's sort of irrespective of how long it took to get there.
As soon as the pride hits, it makes all the pain to reach that pride feel null. It outweighs the pain or the struggle. I recently played through Cuphead with my girlfriend. It's kind of the same thing where both Cuphead and Neon White, they have these really short levels, like the levels you can finish in about 2 to 3 minutes, tops. A lot of levels you can finish in like 45 seconds. But the actual experience of practicing it can be like 30 minutes, 45 minutes, kind of depending on how difficult the level is. You will completely forget about that because you're just restarting so quickly. The whole experience is not the full elongated stretch of time. The experience is actually the microcosm of just these little points in time where you're thinking this next run is going to be the one. That's really what you're experiencing, is just that little half second at the very end, right before you hit restart, where you're thinking this next one's the one, and that's the only experience you remember, is like that little high of like, I'm almost about to get it. It's that dopamine treadmill that you get locked in, right? It's like why people gamble, even though the chances are against them really making a lot of money and they know that. It's just that high of, but it could be. That's really the only part of the memory that persists. All the ways in which it's a total failure can just drown out toward that feeling of possibility and hope. Because speedrunning is so about refining small steps, it really feels so close success. Oh man, that one run I just did, there was just one moment that I screwed up. All I have to do is that. It's easy to forget all the ways in which that moment is the end point along a long series of steps that are actually quite complicated. And so it's not really that one moment, but the feeling is like, oh, that's the only thing I need to do. It's a wonderful way that the game is enjoyable. It makes success so close.
Speedrunning specifically can look from the outside like, let's say, a waste of time. It looks like people are spending too much time on what is ultimately just a game, and they could be applying themselves to something more important. But any act of discipline can hone your ability to use that discipline for good later. Even if someone is spending a lot of time on a speedrun or spending a lot of time playing any game that requires them to do the same thing over and over, like a Dark Souls, for example, you end up passively and in a way that is very approachable and fun, enjoying the process of disciplining yourself, right? You end up learning how to commit yourself to a goal, even in the face of hopelessness and in some cases anguish. You can get very angry. But you can still say, well, it doesn't really matter that this is difficult. What matters is I can do it. You can almost view it as a useful delusion, but it's rational once you isolate the actual mechanism of that, right? Which is that the only way to do something hard is to be persistent. You are honing a skill that, even if ultimately it does fail to get you to your current goal, it will help you in the future reach other goals.
In one sense, every entertainment is a kind of waste of time. If you set a certain kind of goal of like, oh, productivity equals this box, then anything outside of that box is automatically a waste. And video games are usually going to be put outside of that box. But if your goal is a certain kind of practice of something, if you decide like, I'm going to get really good at something, and that thing just happens to be a video game, the fact of it being in the category video game is irrelevant to the fact that you chose to be really good at something. And that act of choosing to be really good at something is of value in terms of discipline, in terms of habit, and actually committing yourself to something. And that could be to anything. There's a kind of like asocial quality to it that makes it hard to respect in mass. Society looks down at anyone who sits in a room quietly. It's nice that there's people who reach that level of prowess, or at least like have something that they can say they can be proud of for themselves. If you're a stand-up comedian and you just get good at it, even if you never make it as a career, I think that's just impressive just because you fell in love with something and you got good at it. A game like this, a game like Neon White, is a great example of some of the collaboration that happens between players and developers. It's like the developers actually get to be directly influenced on the ways in which, wait a minute, if players want to do this kind of thing, what is the core fun of that? What is the aspect of speedrunning that makes it so addictive for people? And how can we package that for a wider audience? Neon White is taking like that lesson from what speedrunners do and is playing with it. There's definitely ways that you could probably break this game, break in the sense of like cut past times and probably finish the whole game in 30 minutes or something. I bet a lot of the ways were anticipated by the developers simply because like that's the point, right? This is like a very like community oriented game. It's about you playing fast, and the developers know you're going to play fast, and so they're going to give you lots of tools along the way, but they're also going to give you a lot of guidance for those who haven't experienced this before, hadn't done a speedrun before, like you and me. This is like a culmination of a kind of long form collaboration that's taken many, many, many years among developers. On YouTube, you could find videos of developers reacting to speedruns of their games. They're typically not angry about it. It's usually like very enjoyable for them to see some of the ways in which players can really be creative within the confines that the game developers had set. And of course, there's some bugs that developers can laugh at themselves a little bit, like, oh, I can't believe that was in the game. Like, how did they do that? And it's shocking.
Oh, he's running. Why is he running sideways? What's that about?
I mean, it makes me think that I may have fucked up and made it faster than run sideways. But I didn't want to think about that too hard.
Often that shock is mixed in with the developer feeling really impressed. You really thought outside of the box, and I thought I knew this box better than you. Developers spend thousands of hours on these games, right? They have to know it better than us in one fundamental sense. But it's a great example about how the avenue by which you entered into knowing something can completely change the meaning of that knowledge.
The developers are doing their part to create this experience of collaborative yet adversarial kind of fun. They're together just having fun by making rules and then immediately breaking them.
When I was a game tester and like we would send bugs to developers, they would often be able to understand the logic of the break, and that's what made it easier for them to fix. As soon as you mention it to them, they're like, oh, it's obvious. I could have figured that out myself if I had just thought through that logic. The speedrunners aren't cursed by that knowledge in the same way. They can catch ways of breaking it that are fully illogical to the ones who had made the logic behind the system. That's great. Then you're teaching each other something about the boundaries of framing. Once you lock into like a certain organization of processing information, it becomes really hard to see outside of that organization, and players get to see that and they get to contribute. It's wonderful that you really are creating something with creators. It's an aspect of gaming that's probably underspoken about. It's not like I can watch a movie and break the movie. I could literally grab the tape and rip it apart, but I'm not breaking something fundamental about the movie. But if you crack a game and speedrun through it, you're actually doing something within the rules of that game. You're showing the developers, the creator of that game, something about their own rules that they didn't fully grasp initially. And it causes a smile on many developers' faces.
That word break doesn't properly convey the fact that everything that the players do to find the gaps in the design. You're opening up the game and showing the developer a game that they didn't know was already there.
Neon White is giving just this little taste of like why it's exciting to have the rules be set like that, and to have the solution to breaking those rules be both mental and physical in the sense of needing to execute. There's a lot of levels, especially later on, where the execution, I knew exactly what to do. And it was just like executing really well. And it's cool that the game is just playing with that feeling, you know, and just giving the player, like, again, back to back, a kind of joy in the prowess of execution with mental and physical capacity.